Welcome to episode 29 of the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Today's topic, racial fantasy traits. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Once again, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and this is the World Builder's Anvil. And today I want to talk a little bit about fantasy racial traits. Now, if you listen to my episode on cultural traits, it's sort of a prerequisite for this. I don't want to go over the categories I look at for traits again. However, I'm going to do a quick overview and really focus on things I think about when I build races. What I think about a lot for races are physical. And you have to keep in mind this is in the scope of your storytelling. So if you're in one world, you don't have to get too much into the thought about what is the gravity there in comparison to here. If the gravity that they have is a lot stronger than Earth, they're going to naturally be stronger. However, you want to think of it from the scope as what is the average of the world. Is the race going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker, a little bit smarter, a little bit more dexterous, a little healthier, wisdom, charisma, whatever you want to think about in the scope of basic attributes of a race. And so when it comes to physical attributes, if a high portion of the race has this, to the point where it would be very unusual for them not to, it becomes a trait. So for example, in my world, I have a group of orcs. Orcs are about as strong as humans. They're about as intelligent. They are about as dexterous, maybe a little less than humans, but they're healthier. They can take a punch. They're survivors. They're strong survivors. They're tough to kill. However you want to call it, these are the things I think about. Also, like humans, they quickly adapt to new scenarios. So when they're put into an area where they're forced to adapt, racially they have the ability to do it. Now, there is some cultural resistance with the cultures of the orcs in my world, but it's strictly cultural. The race has the ability to adapt on the level of humans. But that's what I think about physical. Now, physical also gets into sensory perception. So, how is the hearing? Can they hear as good? Are they as alert as other people? Like token elves would have a higher level of alertness than other races, except for maybe wizards. However, they're very, very acute hearing, and that's why a lot of people think they have a little bit larger ears, or maybe people think they have larger ears because of the hearing. But when you start having physical traits, especially like hearing, how do they hear? Is it through ears? If it's through ears, is there a special shape to the ears? Is there something about the way they work that make them work better on average than the other races involved? Same thing with vision. Can they see different spectrums of light than humans? Is the spectrum ability just a wider spectrum? Do they get as much detail? Maybe they can see much further out, sort of telescopically, where it's almost like they have binoculars in their eyes. Maybe their vision's weak. But these are all the kinds of things that you really need to think about when you think about physical traits. And this is what I think about a lot with races. It's typically physical and mental. If you go back to my cultural traits episode, you'll know that I really think a lot about physical and mental when I think about traits for races. Not so much for cultures, but for races I do. So let's move on to mental. Mental. Can they think as quickly? Can they adapt? Is there just a natural wisdom about them? Or maybe about certain things? If magical is tied to intelligence, does that make a race that's more magical more intelligent? If it's not really important. But if it is tied to mental, this is where you would talk about it being a magical race. Maybe you have a different attribute like spiritual, Sort of like think of fairies. If you want to think of like Don Metcalf, you can think a little bit about fairies and how do fairies have their ability. Are their attributes really the same as what we think about normally in the physical world of strength, intelligence, health, dexterity, wisdom? Is it the same? Social. This is where I put stuff like beauty, or if they have a voice about them that is soothing or ugly. And once again, it is in comparison to what the other races think. Something like beauty can change a little bit over time. However, I typically don't worry about that when I consider about a racial gifted thing. If there's a racial gifted, beautiful race, it's probably going to actually make it more stagnant across the world what beauty looks like, and there'll be less shifting. Or if you look on Earth, go back to the time of Queen Victoria, or really even further back. Let's go back in the Middle Ages Europe. If you are a skinny, waif-looking person who is suntan and sort of an athletic build, you're probably not going to be considered attractive. The reason is you're not survivable. If there's a shortage of food, you're likely to die. You can't afford to eat excess food to be prepared for that. And a lot of times, the things that wealthy people can do in cultures end up becoming what that culture views as beautiful. However, when racial beauty gets wrapped up into the mix, I kind of cheat a bit and say, this is going to be more permanent. This is going to be the way people perceive beauty. And as long as that race is around, the effect of that race on what is considered beautiful by the people around them is going to match it. Once again, it goes into voice. Maybe they have beautiful singing voices. Maybe they have hideous voices. Maybe their mere visage causes fear. In Childhood's End, there's a wonderful race of aliens in there. And without giving it away, if you see them as a human, you're not going to like it. And if you've not read Childhood's End, I really suggest you go do that. I will not give a spoiler about it, but read that book. You will look at the movie Independence Day in a new and disappointing fashion. I kind of feel it took the core idea of Childhood's End and really made it into a bad movie. A fun movie, but a bad movie. I really don't think much about vocation when I think about races in my world. Sometimes I do, if they're very specialized in where they can live. However, if they're not very specialized in where they can live, I don't consider vocational. A lot of times people will do this. I will tie vocational much more to a race than I would anything else. Because, I would tie vocational back to a culture more than anything else. And the reason is the culture is usually more tied to an area, to certain activities. Races to me are just physical descriptions of a group of individuals. However, where I might vary is if you have skill-based magic and it's a magical race, they're going to probably have magic wherever they go, and they'll probably have at least certain levels of those skills. Combat, if they're exceptionally built towards it, I might give a little bonuses here or there to combat. But as it comes to fishing or being artisans, that's a cultural trait from the way I run it, not a racial trait. However, you can think of it however you want to. The more common way people typically associate dwarfs and maybe gnomes in different worlds with the ability to be great artisans. Elves are great with bows, people usually think. Or orcs, I'm not sure what orcs are supposed to be good at. And goblins are good at nothing in most worlds. But your world can be different. I like tying it to a culture because to me a culture is more important ultimately than a race. A race just gives physical descriptions. Allies and enemies, there might be sort of a natural instinct towards this in certain races. If you have a world that came up with a natural predator and a natural prey becoming sentient, or two natural predators that compete over territory as sentient, there might be some racial animosity towards it, and I would list it here as more of a racial thing. And it would lay in with any cultural allies and enemies as well too. However, I would consider that slightly different. Now, this is a fairly short episode. Traits are just, once again, common things where, think of a parabola, a grading curve. That's what defines a trait. So this is going to be a basic rating episode. And once again, just think about it as in, do 95% of the people in a racial group carry this trait. If they do, it's a cultural trait. This is a good way to unbalance your world. If you make one race too powerful, why are they not going to just dominate? You'd have to talk about that. Or at least know about that. You don't necessarily have to explain it to other people, but you want to know why. If you have a race that's exceptionally powerful, why they wouldn't take advantage of all the other races. The world building task for the day is take a race from your world and identify its traits. Once again, those things that rise up to that 95% threshold of everyone having. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. Some will be even better. Some will be worse. However, what is that 95% at? If they're uglier, you make them ugly. If they're prettier, you make them pretty. And if there's really no difference in your races and it's maybe more of a cosmetic thing, then you can still have a race that way. It all depends on how you want to break them down. I probably wouldn't break them down unless the aesthetics were extremely different. And the other thing to consider too is if you ever take a world and move it into a universe, you then have to start considering what's the difference in planets and how that affects the average of the story group that you're talking about. The real world task for the day: accept apologies when offered. If you believe someone offers you a sincere apology and you're offended, suck it up and say, accept it. And mean it. Act like it. Even if you don't want to, even if you're embittered, just accept apologies. In 12, 24, 36 hours, you'll feel better for it than holding in animosity because someone has wronged you, or at least you've perceived they've wronged you. And sometimes you'll find out that you're wrong with being wronged, and you weren't. It's just a misunderstanding. But if someone actually sincerely apologizes, just accept it. Do your best to get over it. The T's: fantasy, racial, appearance. And yes, too, I'm disappointed this is not called Fantasy Racial Fashion Show. But for me,
and as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.